Welcome to Trine Days Roundtable number 12. The Hegelian Dialectic must be dismantled before we can build world peace. With host Chris Milligan, featuring husband and wife co-authors Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould. I am Bruce DeTorres. I moderate these roundtables. And they were inspired by the Valediction, Paul and Liz's two-book memoir, available at TrineDay.com, about their journey into history and mysticism. They focus the roundtable discussions on creating a world peace plan that culminated in the completion of their proposal. It can be read online at valediction.net under the title World Peace on the masthead. After Paul and Liz present, everyone can ask questions and we'll all discuss everything. But first, our host, Chris Milligan.
Well, hello and good day, and thanks all for coming. You know, I've just been thinking about a couple of things, and they'll become more apparent during the presentation here, I believe. But I always wondered, you know, how come they call us white folk Caucasians? And where is the Caucasus? It's out in the middle of Asia there. And there's a lot going on many thousands years ago. And just another little thing is Ukraine and Afghanistan redo, okay, where they got the Russians to come in. I'm not saying, you know, not trying to put value judgments on any of this. I'm just looking at it. As I've said many times, we live in very interesting times, and it is up to us to create the future. So let's do it.
Thanks so much for coming. It's great to see you. What I plan on doing is basically giving you an overview. I think when Bruce mentioned the fact that the proposal that really was drawn from the many of the roundtables that we have been talking through, and now we have a completed proposal. And what we're going to be doing today is basically giving you a quick overview, just to bring you up to speed. And then it's the final chapter that is in the proposal that we'll review. So we will have the entirety, and hopefully that will help us to take the next step, which is, where to go from here. So the overview is going to start where we started originally. It's about JFK. Most of us are aware of the fact that, he has been rated as one of our greatest presidents, which we know is a testament to his ability to inspire hope, faith, and courage in Americans. He asked us to take the most important challenge of our times in 1963 by helping him to create world peace. His American University speech laid out that plan in the words that are powerful, so powerful, in fact, he could have lost his life just based on those words alone. Resurrecting JFK's plan for world peace is long overdue, and we, the people, must do it. We, the people, can do it, and we, the people, will do it. And the first step for we, the people, is to imagine the peaceful future we want, starting now. The next step is to unlock our feelings of fear and despair about the threats to our planet from the endless war agendas we face. Unlocking our creative power to imagine the peace we want will enable it to materialize as our future. And once unlocked, the full potential for that future will provide the place for that peace to happen. The next step is we will intertwine JFK's 1963 blueprint for world peace with Afghan tribal leader Bachir Khan's indigenous non-violent movement known as the Kunde Khidmatgar. This would be combined with historical and mythical stories from the Fitzgerald family's Irish roots. The finished plan would be delivered in a musical concert in Ireland and modeled after the 1985 Live Aid concert for famine relief. The sponsors of Live Aid took an issue nobody cared about, put it in front of 2 billion people, and through music raised $127 million. But not only are millions still living at risk today from famine in the third world, the first world is facing an unprecedented food crisis of its own. This exposes the truth that focusing on famine relief was never going to be a remedy for famine itself. And our concert will promote a genuine solution, establishing peace as the only underlying foundation that will address all human-made problems. Our musical focus will be modeled after the American tribal love rock musical Hair. In its time, Hair was the center of the anti-Vietnam War movement, delivering a riveting political social awakening that we experienced personally in 1970 as participants in the Boston production of Hair. Hair's finale song, Flesh Failures, Let the Sun Shine In, could become an anthem for the worldwide peace movement. The song led audiences to recognize with their own hearts that all the people want peace and not war. It is a plea that still stirs the soul and will re-energize the movement we are building today. Our effort towards peace will accomplish many things by breaking us free from the war dialectic of defeating the other and opening us to a self-aware perspective that can function as a spiritual and moral gauge for testing our own values. The concert will also be a reawakening to bring back the peace robbed from our generation by dark forces manipulating from behind the scenes. And finally, the perfect setting for the concert will promote the world peace through healing music at a 5,500-year-old UNESCO World Heritage Site north of Dublin, known as Newgrange, or in Irish, Brún Agusa. This legendary site is central to pre-Christian Irish mythology, having been built by the Dagda, the father of the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the Sidhe. Known as the Good Father, he was the benefactor to all the people. Described as a passage grave, the Brú was a house where the dead could pass in and out of supernatural reality and into this world at will. Most of all, Newgrange will stimulate the imagination towards a deeper connection to the past and the evolution of human thought that has been forgotten to both the East and the West. And now we'll go into more specifics about the Hegelian dialectic and why it is so critical for we, meaning we, the people of the United States, to understand how much we have really been drawn into a dialectic, and we need to recognize the signs of it and how to work with people in a more positive way once we do recognize it. Today's empire, American empire, was established in the post-World War II era, with the US acting as the receiver for British mercantile interests. Along with its corporate elites and imperial mandate, the US inherited the Hegelian dialectic, a 19th century European worldview, which is based on the belief that conflict creates history. And it is pretty obvious today that the conflict is the only thing it's creating. The dialectic derived from German philosopher George Hegel's 1925 critique of natural law, in which he posited a theory of social and historical evolution. Hegel's new manner of thinking, with its thesis, antithesis, synthesis, revolutionized thought and served as a tool for a new breed of social engineer eager to overthrow the old world order. Hegel's dialectic acted as the foundation for the communist economic theories of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. In essence, Hegel disputed the theory of universal natural rights espoused by other philosophers, such as Immanuel Kant, thereby laying the foundations for what we now can recognize as totalitarianism. According to Hegel, human society could only achieve its highest state and mankind its highest spiritual consciousness through endless, self-perpetuating ideological struggles and conflicts between extremes. This conflict of opposites, when applied to social, political, and economic systems, would result in the synthesizing of opposites, which would inevitably lead mankind to final perfection. But the evidence of the invisible dialectic controlling the narrative can be found everywhere. Environmentalists against private property owners, Christians against Muslims, communists against capitalists. No matter what the issue, the invisible dialectic controls the conflict and the resolution, yet it now seems that Hegel's progress toward perfection has only led to a new and more deadly cycle of conflict. The Hegelian dialectic works as a powerful tool for legitimizing whatever dialogue advances the global interests or want. And looking back over the last 100 years, it is impossible not to see how the deliberate use has created a corrupted synthesis of state power. At a micro level, this phenomena can be observed now taking over American politics. By this definition, state power requires the rule of law minimal corruption, judicial independence, and state monopoly over the means of coercion, as well as political culture of trust and compromise rather than distrust and conflict. But when the state's monopoly on coercion leads to distrust and conflict, then Hegel's method has reached a contradiction it cannot escape. When democracies cling to legitimacy based solely on their use of coercion on its own citizens, they are no longer democracies, but a fascist totalitarian state. Economics and historian Anthony Sutton belittled the Hegelian method by writing that at its best, quote, it replaces the divine right of kings with the divine right of the state. So based on America's failures in Afghanistan and Iraq, the tumult in the greater Middle East, and now in Eastern Europe, has the Hegelian dialectic run its course? The American empire is at a turning point politically and economically and socially, and the dialectic of endless conflicts has proved ruinous to the health of Western civilization. The only way to defeat the downward progression of Hegel's hypothesis is to step outside the dialectic and free ourselves from its limitation of controlled thought. By moving away from a reliance on the monopoly of coercion and reaffirming our belief in the natural rights of all humans, we will return the foundations of legitimacy to the American government. Sutton frames the Hegelian dialectic as against the spirit and the letter of the US Constitution by stating how we the people grant the state some powers and reserve all others to the people and not self-appointed elites running the state. If Americans truly believe the rights of the state are always subordinate and subject to the will of the people and the consent of the governed, and that all people are endowed with inalienable rights and are created equal, then the time has come to reevaluate the dialectic and return to our time-worn natural rights. The West can be restored, but only if Westerners rediscover their individual rights and those principles and traditions that they claim to uphold. It is a time for Western leaders to understand that the dialectic which demands perpetual conflict is a losing cause that has become self-defeating wherever it is applied. Ultimately, it can only lead to self-annihilation. As difficult as it may be for Westerners to grasp, the West's future lies in a process of rehumanization so it can address its own identity crisis. To quote from renowned philosopher Marshall McLuhan, quote, "We're standing on the threshold of a liberating and exhilarating world in which the human tribe can become truly one family and man's consciousness can be freed from the shackles of mechanical culture and enabled to roam the cosmos. I have a deep and abiding belief in man's potential to grow and learn, to plumb the depths of his own being, and to learn the secret songs that orchestrate the universe. We live in a transitional era of profound pain and tragic identity quest, but the agony of our age is the labor pain of rebirth." And now I would like to introduce you to a very special friend of Paul's and mine. It's Seema Wali. Seema Wali was our Afghan partner. We met her in 1998. She was the first Afghan refugee to arrive here in 1978, hosted by former US Ambassador to Afghanistan, Theodore Elliott. As a cousin to the 1920s King Amanullah, Seema came with the authority of the royal family, and after asking us why the Afghan problem had gotten worse instead of better following the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, we decided that we had to consider looking back into the Afghan story. Seema's challenge renewed our belief that something had to be done, and we were soon assisting her by writing articles and speeches which she delivered to the most prestigious audiences. But despite Seema's importance and the media had no interest at all in the issue of Afghanistan from the perspective of the Afghan people. So we began a new chapter in the saga. In 2009, our book, Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story, was published, and we asked Seema to write the introduction. In a penetrating voice filled with hope and despair, Seema presented her case on behalf of the forgotten Afghan people. And now Paul will deliver Seema's words that reveal how her homeland of Afghanistan was willfully destroyed by the American practitioners of the Hegelian dialectic.
Invisible History: Afghanistan's Untold Story is a phenomenal compendium of history, research, and analysis of the complex dynamics that led to the death of my home country, Afghanistan, a nation as old as history itself. For Afghanistan, the aftermath of the Cold War resulted in a genocide of more than 2 million civilians, 5 million war victims, 1 million handicapped, and scores of internally displaced people. I had spent 2 decades seeking an explanation for why Afghanistan was sacrificed in the war against the Soviet Union. This book unravels that great mystery as it bears testimony for all humanity about one of the great invisible injustices of our time. I fled Afghanistan for the US in 1978 after a Marxist coup overthrew the last member of a dynasty that ruled my country for nearly 250 years. My family was put under house arrest because, as allies to the West, we were on the wrong side of Afghan politics. My family was very close to the Americans. We believed Americans shared our vision of Afghanistan, where all Afghans could live in a bright future through education, cultural exchange, and economic development. Despite the obstacles inherent in moving an underdeveloped Afghanistan into the 20th century, it was a time of great promise. Kabul was a peaceful international city with ancient ties to the East and the West. Tourists flocked from all over the world to enjoy our cosmopolitan Islamic culture, free from the strictures of extremism. I left behind a culture that was on the path to democracy. It had been a golden era where the voices of women were included as necessary to the development of our country. Back then, I was accustomed to the active role of women in politics. I was exposed to empowered women in my family and the larger society who held cabinet posts and worked alongside men. I promised to remain a voice for these people and dedicated myself to their memory. I still grieve for the Afghan people I left behind and the lost opportunities for the democratic-minded Afghan people. In 1981, I established Refugee Women in Development, an organization dedicated to helping displaced women and victims of war from around the world to make a new way of life. For many years, preceding the downfall of the Taliban, my organization was unable to conduct programs inside Afghanistan. We were centered in Pakistan. There, I listened to the voices of increasingly desperate men and women. I anguished over how to explain what I learned, that despite the growing awareness of the total destruction from the war, the Afghan people were mostly absent from campaigns waged on their behalf by the United States. I realized that this callous treatment of my people who had served the US in the war against the Soviet Union would leave them vulnerable to a far more pervasive enemy. That enemy emerged as the Taliban. During my visits to Pakistan prior to 9/11, the women of Afghanistan and their male consorts braved minefields and mountain passes to secretly meet with me. I listened to the women who ran schools, provided health care, human rights, and social services for the Afghans inside Afghanistan and Pakistan. Traumatized and desperate, they spoke of the poverty, suicide, and growing hopelessness that saw their dreams for a free Afghanistan swallowed by an army of Islamist mercenaries from all over the world, armed by Pakistan. How did the world community allow such heinous crimes to be committed against a nation of 26 million people? I still hear their cries. During this time, I carried with me their pleading voices and ultimately their screams, while the world looked away. Now, as we conclude another decade of war, their screams rise again within me as I witness the Taliban resurgence. The draconian Taliban rule stripped women of their basic human rights. Their edicts against women led to a new form of violence termed gender apartheid. Strict limitations on women's public space and education did galvanize American feminists on behalf of Afghan women. This solidarity with the most oppressed women in the world itself was novel. That women's alliance and their influence on foreign policy became a powerful factor in the resolution of the worldwide refugee problem. I can state for the record that Afghan women were the canaries in the mineshaft, bearing witness to the inhumanity of a regime against its own citizens. Still, in the US today, there remains a profound lack of understanding about the Taliban, what political forces they represent, and what their objectives are. The dearth of accurate information on their origins has resulted in a succession of dangerous policy initiatives from Washington. The consequences have negated any chance for a successful restoration of an Afghan republic. It opened Afghanistan to cross-border raids from Pakistan, while at the same time providing a platform for the resurgence of the Taliban. Once the Soviets departed and the Americans deserted Afghanistan, desperate Afghans living in Pakistan became indoctrinated into the Taliban's fundamentalist mentality. Due to the dismal conditions following the war, many young Afghan men were forcibly recruited to join the Taliban. Over the years, as I witnessed the breakdown of civil society due to the long-term effects of the war on the people, I also witnessed the growth of the madrasa system of fundamentalist education in Pakistan. Many refugee families confirmed to me that the only way for their boys to receive education was through the madrasas. During that time, the Taliban's influence grew over the Afghan refugees in Peshawar, as well as in Afghanistan, as the war continued to drain resources required to maintain a civil society. Encouraged by Pakistan, while Americans looked the other way, the Pakistani madrasas continue to provide indoctrination and recruitment for the Taliban as it grew stronger by the day. To set the record straight, the term Taliban and the movement itself were unheard of in Afghanistan until 1996. Prior to that year, the Taliban mentality and the madrasa structure did not exist. As an invention of Pakistan's military intelligence with outside help, the Taliban were recruited from Pakistani madrasas. This process was funded not by the Afghans, but by the Saudis and other Arab countries who continue to seek their long-term goal of a political and religious transformation of South Asia, combined with the dissolution of Afghanistan as a nation state. Historically, the version of Islam practiced by Afghans was moderate. The Taliban version of Deobandi Islam practiced in Pakistan and the Wahhabism practiced in Saudi Arabia were alien to Afghanistan. Suicide bombings did not exist in Afghanistan until after the Soviet occupation. The Afghan people never willingly embraced extremist Islam. These ideas were forced upon them under circumstances beyond their control. Regardless, during the debates establishing the post-Taliban government for Afghanistan in 2001, Islamist principles that had never been a part of previous constitutions were infused into the new constitution. Many leaders in the new government of Afghanistan subscribed to extremist Islamic ideologies that were never a part of Afghan politics. And so, where in the past extremism held little sway within the political process, the conflict between moderates and extremists has now become the norm. After years of being driven from power by the American military intervention of 2001, today the Taliban enemy is once again reemerging as a tenacious and relentless insurgent force. But even with a military occupation, the US and the West still do not perceive that their failure in Afghanistan remains as a direct result of their longstanding inability to adjust to the realities of what needs to be done. It is the failure to listen to the voices of the many Afghans who are capable of ushering in democratic change. This bias permeated American thinking before 9/11. Despite a wealth of new empirical evidence, misconceptions about Afghanistan remain in place today. Following the fall of the Taliban, our effort was to build a democratic civil society. Our philosophy at Refugee Women in Development has been that the grassroots leadership found in local NGOs should play a vital role in promoting a balanced and tolerant society. We developed networking opportunities for local Afghan organizations by strengthening their institutional and leadership capacities through training programs. At first, we were confident that with a combination of American aid and security, the civil society that I had known in Afghanistan could be restored and expanded throughout the country. This was not to be. Today, Afghanistan is again depicted in the worst possible light as a haven for extremists who have hijacked Afghan cultural and religious traditions. The media often promote this misconception and fail to recognize that the Afghan people have themselves been held hostage to external invading forces. These forces have a vested interest in keeping Afghanistan destabilized and weak. They benefit from maintaining misconceptions that prevents Afghanistan from getting enough Western commitment to realistically establish democratic institutions. The international system of law and diplomacy broke down once over Afghanistan. It must not be allowed to break down again. Following 9/11, we had the semblance of a new society, but the Afghan people are again seeing the glimmer of hope dissipate. I no longer fear that Afghanistan will be abandoned. My fear today is that despite all the good intentions, America's over-reliance on targeted missile strikes, chemical spraying, and imprisoning and torturing suspected militants has turned popular opinion in the wrong direction. Combined with an inability to improve the lives of Afghans by even a small measure, America is now viewed as an occupier instead of the friend and ally we want her to be. While many strides have been made to bring women along in reconstruction schemes, these advances are tempered by rampant poverty, violence, lack of water, electricity, and unemployment. Under current circumstances, women are abducted, even jailed, for refusing to accept forced marriages. Honor killings continue, and physical violence have not been adequately addressed, especially in the provinces where warlords rule. Today, the common Afghan man and woman have fear in their hearts and uncertainty about their future. Although we now have a new constitution that claims to guarantee the rights of both men and women, and advances are tempered by rising repression of women's social and political prominence. We as women are at peril from anti-modernist forces that are committed to rolling back the gains by resorting to the so-called Islamic argument. The protection of women as equal citizens does not figure prominently enough in the Constitution. The world community must not be acquiescent with tokenism or symbolic assurances. What Afghanistan and its people desperately need is not misplaced charity, but long-term strategies for sustainable democracy. This can only be done if the international community makes a permanent commitment to 1, staying the course of nation building, 2, committing enough finances to sustain long-term development, 3, heeding the voices of the moderate Afghan people, and 4, involving Afghan women who constitute 67% of the population. Building on a ravaged nation with only 33% of its human resources is simply not sound economics. The world community, and especially the United States, realize that Afghanistan is a country of special interest, but it still remains a country whose history and struggle for democracy is largely obscured by propaganda. Afghans have endured and continue to endure unspeakable trauma. To this day, I am exposed to the impact this war has on women, men, and children, and bear witness to their families' lifelong trauma. It has led me to question why anyone can claim the right to sacrifice innocent victims while pursuing their own political agendas and economic interests. Invisible history clarifies and corrects the record. It builds on a foundation upon which the whole story of Afghanistan's past can be appreciated. It is filled with groundbreaking analysis, not only of the more recent politics of Afghanistan, but the larger historical context necessary to grasp the immensity of this tragedy. It will stand as a 21st century guide, not only to what was lost in the destruction of Afghanistan, but to what can still be done to reconstruct a future where all Afghan men and women can live with it the peace and plenty they deserve.
And
That,
now,
of course, was 10 years ago.
right, that was in 2009. It was that clear in 2009, and we had actually warned Seema when we first met her that the plan was never to rebuild your country. And part of our work has been to try and help Seema especially, and other Afghans too, but in particular Seema, to understand that it really didn't make any difference. And we now all know the ultimate outcome. The Taliban are back, women are completely imprisoned again, and the country is in total chaos, and the US basically stole all of the finances of the Afghans. So unfortunately, it's just going from bad to worse, and that is exactly what we were very, very concerned about all along. The saddest part is that Seema ended up probably at some point in the mid 2000s, at some point in one of her trips to Afghanistan, she apparently, when she mentioned the chemical spraying, at some point she must have encountered something of that nature, and she came down with some kind of a very tragic autoimmune disease that eventually killed her in 2017. And unfortunately, in fact, there is a little story though I'd like to add about some of the ironies that we notice and the synchronicities and why we feel sometimes it's very important to be able to pull these little things in. If anyone knows our work, you all know that we consider Zbigniew Brzezinski to be the individual official from the US government who is most responsible for actively choosing and using Afghanistan to win the Cold War against the Soviet Union. Well, there is a little irony that happened in 2016. Brzezinski actually wrote an article trying to suggest that the United States really needed to pull back from its use of the military to really solve all problems and had to become, one would have to say, a more mature empire, let's put it that way, possibly to use diplomacy and talking instead of just dropping bombs. Well, Brzezinski ended up dying in 2017. I believe it might have been May 2017, and Seema ended up dying in September of 2017. It turned out that Brzezinski died in the same town that Seema died in, Falls Church, Virginia. Now, I don't know, how close a match that is, but there is some symmetry about the woman who for us embodied Afghanistan, who really believed so deeply in the suffering of the people. And not all Afghans that came to the United States had that clarity. A lot of them became more American and more distant. She never gave up on the people. And that tragedy died with her, the sadness died with her. But there is something incredibly ironic about the fact that Brzezinski died in the same town within months of her, and ended up maybe in some etheric sense, they encountered each other, who knows? Anyway, that's it.
Thank you very much, Paul and Liz. We are in the roundtable portion of the roundtable. All questions and, raise your hand, shout out. I'll moderate as lightly as possible. I'll start with a couple of quick questions. Paul, you quoted Seema saying in 78, at a time of a kind of a golden age, maybe you said. I know that, but when did that kind of start forming? And you could briefly just tell me, like, when, if that was a golden age by 78, when might it have begun to blossom?
1973. It was really, Afghanistan had been left pretty much alone as a buffer state, and that was what was very important about it. But
well, actually, I do think we could bring up King Amanullah creating the Constitution as a sign of how advanced the Afghans were in terms of being on a democratic path. They created a constitution in 1923 that basically gave women the right to vote. Okay, so the idea, and this is all part of the horrible tragedy of what did happen to the Afghan people, where many Americans and people around the world believe that this is something that's normal, that women are not allowed to work and be out in public.
The framework of that was really what Liz just said. It was very exceptional for that to happen at the time. Granting women the right to vote. This was a very aggressive guy, and he was courting Europeans, and he courted the Americans as well to try to come in and help. This was at the beginning, it's 1919. And the Americans were just simply deferred to the British Empire. And the British Empire had absolutely no interest in creating an independent Afghan state that was very progressive. And so as a result of that, what happened was that it remained as a buffer state under the control, and I think even a protectorate of Great Britain following that for many years, even after World War II. So, but the fact is that by 1973, the Cold War started to catch up to that relationship. Okay, Britain was no longer a dominating influence. In the United States, really, they came back to the United States, and Afghanistan did back in the 1950s, and requested to be an ally. And they say, well, we have Pakistan as an ally. Pakistan is set up. It was designed and created by the British military, and it really operates kind of in our favor. And so as a result of that, we've got observation bases there. We're looking at China. We're looking at the Soviet Union. So we don't really need Afghanistan. So Afghanistan went shopping, and the Soviets were more than happy to help on their southern border, to help an adjoining nation. They already had Tajikistan and Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan as part of their independent republics. So they were familiar with the nature of what had to be done. And the old saying was, the further away you got from Moscow, the safer you were. but within the confines of the Soviet republics. And so they had a lot of freedom. They had a lot of leeway to do what they wanted to do. And so it wasn't really until 1973 when the king's cousin, Muhammad Daoud, overthrew the king that the era of this golden age kind of ended. There was a peaceful competition going on between the United States and the Soviet Union, which really resulted in the Afghans benefiting. I mean, the roads got paved, the bread factory got built, the Russians built roads from the north down, and the United States built roads from Iran to Afghanistan, to Kabul. So it really was a benefit for that. And a lot of Afghans came to the United States. A lot of Afghans went to the Soviet Union to be educated. Women had really, it was a growing period for women to be able to express themselves and participate in government. So
That's that's so unknown to anyone following mainstream America for the last 40 years. It's so opposite to reality. Thank you very much for that robust answer. I want to jump to the first question from Carol in the chat. How do we end this insane Hegelian dialectic
Right.
process?
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I was just going to dive in, because the whole point of hearing Seema's words, we wanted you to hear the words of a victim. That's what Seema represents. She carries the tears and the screams, as she said, of the Afghan people who didn't understand why this was happening to them. And this is what happens when this this is a Western view of the world. This is, Cecil Rhodes, I think, possibly is a very good example. You go in with a kind of assumption, you're bringing something that's wonderful, and you have decided, and people, I don't think always understand they're actually engaging in this Hegelian dialectic. It's become normalized. I think they call it American exceptionalism, I think, is one of the ways that it's described today, where you have this automatic assumption, no matter what, that you basically always do good. And if something turns out bad, well, that can happen, but somehow it's not really your responsibility at some level. And when you look at the case of Afghanistan through Seema's eyes, because when she said those words in 2009, okay, you can see that the handwriting was on the wall long before the disastrous departure of the U.S. in 2021, which many people view as the first time they were really aware that it wasn't at all what we were being told it was. So maybe in terms of the dialectic, Carol, that it might be that as we become aware of this way of thinking, number one, and I think we also have to realize that we've been inculcated in it ourselves. So we have to make the effort to make sure that we're not allowing that kind of thinking to interfere with ourselves and our peers. This is about Americans noticing this in other Americans and making this point that this is something we need to see in ourselves. And this is why, in fact, I loved when JFK, in his speech for peace at the American University, he made a point over and over again of telling Americans, you've got to look within yourself to see what you can do to make yourself more open to peace with the Soviet Union. So I really felt he was onto it.
There was a physicist a few decades ago. He made the observation that there's a timing problem in consciousness, that what we think we see, what we think we hear, we don't react to when it actually becomes a physical reality. That's what's going on with this dialectic, okay? It's been so involved in everything we think, in every way we do, that automatically, we had people, when we were out hawking our book 10 years ago out in California, we went to an event with a number of people and who were very interested in the peace process. They really wanted the peace process to happen. And so I was talking to somebody, and this was at the time when they were trying to get rid of Gaddafi in Libya, I believe. And somebody said, I'm absolutely for peace, complete nonviolence, but that Gaddafi, he's a problem for his own people, okay? he bombs his own people. So we really have an obligation. I think they called it R2P at the time, responsibility to protect, which was a nice propaganda slogan that the administration used in order to, justify the involvement there. So we keep coming up with excuses. Our leadership, our authorities keep coming up with excuses for why we can still do what we always did before, and it's a psychological problem, I would say.
But I think actually, Carol, I would say this in general, I think becoming aware of when you experience it, I think that's the best way to notice it in people. And when you realize that's what you're dealing with, you have to approach the conversation very differently than if you're dealing with someone who's not trapped in that duality, where they really, they really are, like I think Paul's story about where I'm anti-war, but except for this one case. And that is what is going on today, certainly a continuation of what's going on today. We can see that obviously happening in the tragedy in Ukraine, where there is literally no interest at all in negotiation, zero. And that's been from day one.
Nobody seems to care.
Nobody.
I mean, the specter of nuclear war hangs over this. It's ripe with it. And the fact is that everyone's looking at it as if it was some kind of motion picture. It's not real.
Yeah.
So at any rate.
To end the Hegelian dialectic.
Well, I would put it again that I think the first level for everything is in realizing that we are literally, we are saturated in it. I think it is definitely a Western way of viewing the world, and having obviously the whole nature of Western imperialism, obviously, especially through from the Roman Empire to the British Empire, coming over through the British, and then America, being obviously the last, certainly the last empire name possibly. Many people would call the American Empire the muscle for the British Empire, who still very much control a lot of the politics of the world. But so I would say that the first thing is really in becoming incredibly conscious. And I think, again, in terms of all what's going on in Washington is the dialectic on that. I think what's coming out of the Democrats and their attitude towards Republicans and the responses are it's literally a dialectic.
Well, there's also the issue.
Bruce,
I really think we've lost our voice in terms of a public. We're being inundated by so many factions at the same time. I mean, the whole transhumanism movement, the whole nature of the fact that people communicate via cell phones, the fact that, I mean, you walk down the street, everyone's like this in terms of where their identity is. It's not sitting next to somebody and talking face to face with it. Now, there has been a reaction to that. Locally in the Boston area, I know there are schools who are beginning to forbid cell phones, iPhones rather, in class, which is probably a nice start. I think it's too late. I think for some of it, for some level of it is, because I think it's already had a devastating effect on our ability to communicate. There was an article in the New York Times last week about Jan Wenner, who was the Rolling Stones guy, and he talked about the fact that how important music was when he got involved with the magazine in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. The sound, the protest movement, the use of music to communicate soulful ideas,
what we experience in hair,
and face to face with these things, and people would sit and listen to these pleadings through music. And he said it's been devalued. Music doesn't represent our culture any longer. It just simply is out. It's been commoditized, like everything else has been. It's been financialized and commoditized, and as have human beings been. Okay, and so our politics is up for sale. Our music is up for sale. Nothing has meaning any longer. And as a result of that, our tools as human beings, we've kind of been, defanged in terms of what we can actually do and how effective we can. I mean, we can write books, we can speak, we can talk to people and convince them. But, it's very, very hard to do these things and make it meaningful on a global basis, certainly.
Well, it's tough, but I think what's worth moving towards is making yourself the strongest person that you can be to and it's a personal thing. It's almost like one person at a time. When you finally do have the opportunity to affect people, if you really do get popular and have an audience of 1,000 people, you'll be prepared for it. Because we really need to we've got to sell the idea by being that way, by making it so real for everyone who encounters us. And it's hard because not everyone's ready for it. I mean, not everyone's ready to give up the dialectic. That's what I discovered.
And if anyone else, Chris, hi.
Hi. Well, the dialectic isn't a quote unquote evil thing. The dialectic is, okay? I mean, the first, like I say, I call the dialectic the dark hallway, okay? Because you walk down a hallway and you're going to bump into one side and you're going to bump into the other side. It's just a how life is, and then is there a correct way to walk down here on this earth? Is there a right way, a correct way? Okay, and so it's Hegel. Hegel looked at he called the state as the march of God. Okay, and the state is a come together of people. Okay, and it's not evil in itself. Okay, but then he also talks about civil society being different than the state. Okay, and I mean it's most assuredly that the dialectic has been used, the thesis, antithesis, synthesis has been used by people to move history forward in the way that they wish it to be. Okay, and Hegel died in chair in Berlin in 1831. One of his students was Alfonso Taft, and actually there were several other people from Yale that had also taken his class. And then Alfonso Taft went back from Germany and set up the Order of Skull and Bones in 1832. Okay, and so you do have cliques of people, okay, that will use the Hegelian dialectic to foster their own aims. Okay, but the dialectic in itself isn't an evil thing. It just
it's a very effective tool.
Right.
And I think we can see how effective it's been, because it has been used, it has been plucked by some very powerful people and who've made themselves more powerful by using it.
For social control.
But I don't think the average American is aware, or the average citizen is aware of the purposes of the dialectic, unless you're schooled in it. Some people are schooled in it, but the fact is that it has an impact on everyone, but everyone's not aware of the fact that they're being impacted by it.
Well,
it is an attitude that I think when you talk about someone like Henry Kissinger or Zbigniew Brzezinski, and you think of their interpretation of the power of the state being absolute. Brzezinski publicly stated during, I think, the buildup to one of the wars in the last, 20 years, we don't have to, we don't have to recognize the public's opinion. He had no problem saying that. This is the kind of, these are, and I think that is a direct result of the way he interpreted what Hegel had empowered him with. I agree with you, Chris, that everything can be used in any number of different ways. So when we are still being subjected to people who are using it that way, that's a whole other question that we have. I hope we'll get to that question very soon, where we're dealing with people who are actually willing to work together to give up the idea that war is a solution to anything.
I think it's
and
also
work it out.
It's important for people to have the confidence to believe in their own opinions, and I think that that's being discouraged today. I think people are being discouraged from believing what their eyes and ears see and what's in front of them. And I think that once again, this is part of the disempowerment process that is being used against people, and it's intentional. There's no question about it. So I mean, I think it's, human beings, if we can't make the world better for human beings, what are we here for? What are we doing? We need to empower human beings. We need to teach respect for human beings and teach human beings to respect themselves and each other. And I think that, we got to start someplace. And I think that that's a ground level thing, not a higher entity, not some institution. I mean, I think people are ready to look at different ways of which, that's what the foundation of our country was all about. That was what the idea behind the Constitution was, and the Bill of Rights. And I think that, I remember, speaking to a radio show many years ago that, if I went down to, if I stepped in Doctor Who's TARDIS and went back to my high school years and sat down with my history teacher and my civics teacher, and I told them what it was like in 2021, they wouldn't believe me. They said, this is impossible in the United States.
Right.
We have democracy. We have town meetings. We have, a way in which that's what happens in some other country. That happens in a authoritarian society or a totalitarian society. That doesn't happen here. Your opinion is appreciated. Your voice is heard. Well, we know right now our voices aren't heard. So how do we get them heard again? We got to go back to where we came from and say, there we go. Thank you, Chris and Bruce. This is what we have to do. We have to go back to where we started and say, okay, somehow we got off the path here, and we got to get back on the path if we're going to get where we need to go as human beings. I mean, personally, if somebody wants to transform human beings into robots, let them do it. I don't want to go. I don't want to get on a spaceship and go to Mars and have to live there. I don't want to have to leave my body in order to, except when I finally have to. But I'm going to do it on my own terms. I'm not going to do it on, someone who has an NGO and says, okay, your carbon footprint is too big. Go buy smaller shoes so you won't leave such a big carbon footprint. I don't think that's the answer, personally. I think the answer is to find out, what we can really all do together and how we can do it, and not in some kind of top-down order from some kind of authority that claims absolute authority and absolute understanding of everything. That's not American, certainly not an American way of doing things. And that's why everyone wanted to come here, because they had come from authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. They had come from noblesse oblige, where they had to listen to the voice of God through their king or queen. I mean, that's why they came here. They said, we're sick of that. We want to be able to have our own ability to live on our own and make these decisions on our own for the betterment of our children and our grandchildren. And that's what we've lost. We've lost that as a concern. So, I mean, we're talking real basic stuff here.
Right. But the idea, sorry.
Well, Anthony Sutton, okay, who was one of the first people to really start looking at skull and bones, and in his book, America's Secret Establishment, he has a chapter on there about how the order controls education, okay, because that was one of their first goals, okay, because you ask how come, the American people don't know about the dialectic, blah, 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 blah. You look at the people that were educated in the late 1800s and up till about 1930, and they had a good idea of it, okay? But basically, Skull and Bones changed our education system here. They brought in the Prussian education system, okay, that the Prussians had developed after Napoleon beat them, okay, and where they were actual, involved, or you had to send your kids to school, and actually, they came and got them by gunpoint, okay, because the princes on the hill were mad that the people, were getting upset, okay, and so they changed it from, learning how to think and a different kind of edge into teaching you what to think, okay, and that's, pretty much all of us. It was finally through the Masons, called the modern education system, okay, was brought into place very much in almost all communities by the 1950s, okay, and so that's one thing that we're doing here with our personal computer and our internet, is we're trying to educate people about the situations that we have. And again, we all have to live together, right? Okay, we have to live together in a house. Okay, we have to live together in a community. We have to live together in a state. We have to live together in a world. Okay, so there, how are we going to organize that? I mean, you can have a royal tell you what to do. You can have a pope tell you what to do. But we through our forefathers, and that's really where American exceptionalism comes from. Okay, it was Tocqueville who first talked about that. Says here is a new nation that is starting a new way of governing. Okay, so of course you're going to have powers that are going to try, and I mean, they were attacking the American way of government before the ink was even dry on the Constitution.
Exactly.
Right.
So again, it's about developing, okay, governance from the bottom up. And I mean, and how are you going to do that? You're going to do that by voting, right? I mean,
Well,
how else are you going to do it? You're going to, I guess we could do it by lottery. I mean, there are people that talk about that, getting people into political situations by lottery. Then you wouldn't have the people that just want the attention on them and want power. Okay, but again, how are we going to organize ourselves to live together?
Chris, how can you teach kids responsibility to each other, to their families, to their schools, to their community, when the irresponsible are being rewarded for what they do? And all the time you see it. The people who make the bad decisions, the people who make the wrong decisions and never apologize for it, or never even admit it.
It's called ethics. It's called ethics.
There you go. I think that should be part of a preschool understanding of what your responsibility is to your own community. I mean, I've listened to people talk about, the drug problems and the methadone problems and the issues with this. We've got all kinds of problems. I mean, in warm climates, you have terrible problems right in front of you. It gets cold here in the wintertime where we live. So you don't have, some of these things aren't out in the open, but they're there and they're just as bad. And the inability to deal with it from any kind of situation, it becomes a political issue. As you said, people fight over it. They say, who's responsible? Well, the blame game goes from management to blame the unions, blame this one, blame that one.
And that's the dialectic in action, blaming another side.
Exactly.
Can I read a question from Carol?
Sure.
An executive order was introduced on September 12th, institutionalizing transhumanism. Legislation obliterating the First Amendment will bar doctors from speaking in California, if not vetoed by Governor Newsom. Propaganda is dominating the minds and shaping the narrative now. I hope that you can combine your insights with Dr. David Martin, who is battling this narrative in the courts, and most recently in his new documentary, American Revolution, r/evolution, which just premiered recently. That film shatters a lot of the founding myths of America and what has happened since then.
Well,
We take a breath to hear the reply.
yes, I mean, there's no question. These things are marching forward. And that's what I would say to all of us, and is that we have to do what we can. Our contribution was in trying to get to some fundamental foundational truth about what really caused the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Okay. And what did we connect to by doing that? We connected to a mother lode, okay, of the process, not just that one incident. We actually understood the constant process that we've all been surrounded by, which made us aware of the fact that very little that is put out as history can be assumed to be whole, no matter what.
Even by the people who are doing it themselves. I mean, I know we've talked about this before in these previous events and roundtables, but I mean, our experience with Chuck Cogan, who ran Operation Cyclone for 5 years, is a beautiful example, in our opinion, and our own personal example. He personalized it for us of what really happened how this thing happened in Afghanistan that produced Osama bin Laden, that produced 9/11, that produced the Taliban, da 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 da. And he said, you know, when our book came out and Invisible History came out, we did an event at the Cambridge Forum across the street from Harvard University, where Chuck Cogan, who was the Near East South Asian Director of Operations for the CIA from 1979 to 1984, he came out and he said, you know, I really agree with what you, after we spoke, he said, I really agree with what you had to say. He said, the Soviets really didn't want to have to go into Afghanistan. He said, but that bit about Brzezinski, that really just, he didn't lure them in. He said, that's not the way it worked. He said, I ran the operation for 5 years. I ought to know what was going on. And that never happened. So he'd never met Brzezinski. So we went back a few years later and we said, we really want to sit this guy down. And since he ran the operation, tell us some things about it that, you know, we might not have heard before. So anyway, I start my questioning and he interrupts me. He says, can I tell you something? He said, I said, yeah, please. And he said, you know, I came up, Brzezinski came up to Harvard, he said, about a year ago. And he said, you know, he said, I'd never met him. So I went to him and I told him, I said, I never believed that story where that claimed that you had said that you intentionally lured the Soviets to their doom in Afghanistan. And he said, Brzezinski looked at me and he said, yeah, I did. He said, you didn't know what was going on over at Langley. He said, we were doing this at the White House at the National Security Council. He said, you didn't have any idea about it. And he looked at me and he said, I had no idea. He said, I didn't get a whiff of that. So if you have the guy at the Central Intelligence Agency who's responsible for knowing what's going on in the secret field, not knowing what was happening across town at the White House by a national security advisor who intentionally wanted to lure the Soviets to their destruction, then what chance do we have as individuals if we aren't honest with each other and take those people to account and say, something wrong here, something very wrong, and it's at the top of the ladder, and we're getting fed information from the top down, and by the time we finally get the truth out of it, that was what, 2017, 2016?
Yeah.
Something that happened in 1979. We didn't learn first person until 2017 that it had been done that way, and it was a surprise to him. So,
right. And for 40 years, the American people and the Western society has been, you know, given the quote unquote official story, which has got nothing to do with
which goes back
what really happened, you know.
Right.
Which
I
goes
want-
back to what Chris was
Right.
asking about
Yeah.
the nature of what's going on in Ukraine today versus what
Right.
happened.
Well, I just wanted to make a quick point about Chuck Cogan to really make sure that you understand that when you're dealing with people who are within certain circles, okay, you never should assume that even when they seem to befriend you or seem to be on your side, they really might not be in the way you think, okay? When we sat Chuck Cogan down and asked him about the justification effectively for destroying Afghanistan to win the Cold War, Chuck Cogan had no problem at all cheering it on, okay? He had no problem at all. So this is the point about these people get caught up in their world, and we know the CIA is obviously oftentimes on their own agendas and getting away with all kinds of illegal things and all kinds of secret things and all of that.
It was a business deal. That's all.
But the idea, so there is a level at which, you know, this is the kind of thing where anybody can have a bias that comes with them. How someone is raised, what kind of beliefs that they're saturated in, how forceful were those beliefs, you know, how forcefully were they subjected to those beliefs? Were they allowed to come to their own conclusions? You know, there's all different problems that people bring to the table. And we've got to be super open to our own limitations and everyone else's.
Bruce, what's your question?
Well, it's a reflection on the appeal of the title of this roundtable. The Hegelian dialectic must be dismantled before we can create world peace. And Liz, you said something that I put on an ad for this roundtable, end the war inside you, which reflects what you just said. For individuals to become aware of our biases, how our own minds work, how we hear things, and how we are triggered to reply the way we've been trained, I'll say, from a lifetime of watching TV, let's say, or watching now social media for 15 years. It's the same cauldron or chaos. And that speaks to me about how to empower more Americans to handle this conversation, to care about these kind of things, to care about a government from the bottom up, to care about voting, to think that we have some power as individuals is a huge challenge that is raised by dealing with the questions and the purposes of this roundtable, let alone the goal of world peace, because that's very holistic. To end the war inside you, you know, is that a result of understanding what the Hegelian dialectic is? Yes. Yes, it is. So it's a holistic kind of opportunity. And as people who care about enjoying life and care about how other people enjoy life, that's what's at stake. So those are huge, big pullback to look at everything I feel that's going on in this conversation. It's vital.
Yeah. Well, I have a way of describing my personal feeling is that the true battle that many people are facing is literally the battle within the line of their mother and the line of their father within them. And that if you have a divorce in the family, if you had the issues with one parent or another, that literally can disturb your ability to be totally open to the power of both lines. And that's what we all have to do. We all have to have access to the power of each of our creators.
Well, I think, our contribution to this in terms of understanding or helping to break this duopoly that's going on here with the dialectic is the way we wrote the books intentionally. Okay. I mean, we did 10 years ago, we put out, hardcore fact books that were really appreciated by the institutions. And they looked at it and they said, we got asked to review books that were coming out of Rand Corporation for their analysis, our analysis of their analysis of Afghanistan. Was it right? Was it wrong? What it was. Okay. This is different. This is how these books are about how we came to our own conclusions, how we understood. It's our process, talking it out together as we do every day. You can see inside our heads what we're dealing with. The books that we bought, we probably empowered Barnes and Noble there before Amazon even came into being.
But to analyze or comprehend or try to understand the Hegelian dialectic, to reflect right back to what Liz said, that's a great illumination of how automatically we take sides, politically. I identify as a Democrat, let's say. They got me. Like Chris teaches, when you take a side, then you can be manipulated by those who can influence, quote unquote, the official voices of that side.
Let's say you have a clique and it's trying to accomplish a goal through conspiracy. I mean, I run into this in the JFK assassination all the time. People want to bring in all kinds of people into the conspiracy. Well, you don't do that. What you have a very small clique, okay, and you hold it very tight, okay, and you don't invite people into your conspiracy. What you do is you go and lie to them and manipulate them into situations that then benefits your conspiracy. Mm-hmm. Okay, so and that's what we have been has happened. Okay, we have had these cliques of people that have been they don't want us people to have power. They want to have the power to be able to make us do what they want to do. Okay, so we need to continue to establish the people's power.
Yes.
Okay,
exactly.
By all means.
And previously, I think it was Paul comes to mind, referring to the educational system. I am convinced it's such a and disempowering experience. Yeah. Birds must fly to be a bird. And if you kept a baby bird in a cage until it reached full-grown adult age and let it out of the cage, it's not going to be able to fly. And it's never going to be able to comfortably, all things being equal, And I posit, and I don't, that human beings need to make decisions in order to survive. And school doesn't let us make decisions about things that matter. So lately, 18-year-olds go to college and have nervous breakdowns because it's making decisions that quote unquote matter, or just making decisions that for yourself, it's overwhelming. And the point's really made by John Taylor Gatto, the award-winning school teacher who wrote so much about what's wrong about the public school experience. If I remember correctly, he said the average kid can learn basic reading, writing, and arithmetic in 50 hours. What's the 13 or 17 or 18 years for? And that's also why I think American history is no longer front and center in the experience of young Americans, because to read the founding era and the first 80 years, when de Tocqueville was here, and Chris, you alluded to him earlier, it was a frenzy of free people creating their own lives and moving westward, like I've heard Chris say, because they just leave me alone. The more cities and towns get organized, the more rules, regs, and limitations are. So everyone just kept going west, 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 west. And de Tocqueville commented to regal, controlled Europe, Americans, their natural instinct is when they have a problem is they jump in to solve it. Maybe this is pioneer stuff. This is out on the prairie stuff.
Mhm.
They don't go to their government, which obviously you can infer that that's his comparison. At that time in the early 1800s, you want to get anything done, you got to fill out the right forms, you got to apply for permission, you got to pay the right licenses and fees for it, you got to get the right stamps, you got to get the right red tape wrapped all around it. And if we can understand how far below our potential modern Americans are living, if that alone could be, taught, it could, I want to inspire more folks to imagine that I should and could want to make these decisions for myself, and I should and could want to, inspire myself and others along these lines.
By the way, Carol, I mean, this legislation that you just listed here, it's blowing my mind to see it actually written out that way. It's just unbelievable. I've heard some of it, but I think in a way we have to really see all of that as just further proof of their disintegration, their insanity. And yes, they still have power, but in a way, you think about, I mean, we lived for years next to an elderly couple, and in his 90s, the husband of the couple insisted on driving, and he was getting in accidents all the time. And the wife was hysterical because she knew he could kill someone. He wouldn't stop because his identity was wrapped up in actually driving. And literally, it was like, frightening. Okay. So I think we've got that kind of problem at the macro level, so to speak, where they're caught. And that is a way of saying our neighbor was caught in his own dialectic. He literally had identified driving the car is part of his life, and no matter what, he'd rather kill someone than stop. And I think we're looking at the same problem with a lot of these people. So, I mean, it's overwhelming to imagine what can we do. But I think that at some level, I've always found you have to personalize it. You can't think in terms of changing the world. You have to think in terms of changing one person, or changing a group of people, or, where you can begin to, and again, as the influence grows, I mean, that's what we're trying to do. We think we have something to say in our books. We think we have a way of thinking and presenting ideas that may be a little different. And that's kind of what we discovered, truthfully, with Seema Wali. When we heard her story about the suffering of her people and her inability, that she was completely unaware of why the US was doing this to her people. And we were like, oh my God, she really doesn't have any idea at all what happened.
Well, neither
Like Americans.
Neither do so many Americans who have no idea how phony so many official stories are. I got to say, hearing Seema's piece, Paul, when you read it, I was thinking, this is the kind of address to Congress that visiting people used to give
exactly.
Yes.
when it was more an authentic venue for truth.
Mhm. Well, you know what you sometimes have to look at? You have to look at the action. What action is taken? Okay. And, we could see over and over again, especially after, having, investigated the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the entire process revealed to us the fact that there was never any intention ever what did they intend to do with Vietnam once they conquered it, if they will have, been able to do that? The idea that the interests of the American imperial moves, especially when you go back to, let's say, Vietnam and then continue after that, has always been to basically destroy the nationalist leader or any leader who seems to be representing the people in any way, just get rid of them and replace them with some kind of a crook or some kind of a drug dealer or somebody that
Well,
will do the bidding.
the construction of the Afghan government after 9/11, when the US got there, was mind-boggling. I mean, it was just a complete ignorance of what, Afghanistan had been. We went there in 2000.
care,
We went
though.
there in 2002 with SEMA. We
didn't
spent a
care.
month in Afghanistan talking to all the American reporters and the French reporters and the German reporters. And the French, as it turned out, the French had a better idea because they had been involved for a long time with Afghanistan in certain schools, the schooling system and whatnot. They'd been there for 100 years at that point. So they had a better idea and they were far more understanding in terms of what needed to be done. But, high-level American reporters that we interfaced with from all the major, news services, they had no idea.
Clueless.
They were totally clueless. They thought Afghanistan began on 9/11.
Yeah.
They thought the problem began there. They
Yeah.
thought that, it was Osama bin Laden and these
Right.
people.
And it was only and always what the mainstream and what our government
Exactly,
said.
and that's what they
Exactly.
wanted, and
And they never
Yeah.
went outside that understanding,
exactly.
And there were some very brave people who were there. Chris Hondros, he was a reporter who was a cameraman, actually. And he was, I sat with him one afternoon, and we're going to put that on the website, the interview that I did with him in 2002 before he left. And he was this was in October of 2002, a year before the invasion of Iraq. And I said, where are you going? And he said, oh, I'm going to Iraq. I said, wait a minute, that hasn't been approved yet. He says, oh, it's going to happen. He says, he said, everyone's packing up and getting ready. He said, they're all, the business is, we're done with Afghanistan. We're now going to move into Iraq, and that's going to be our focus.
All right.
So he says, I'm going to work my way in from the top down. He was killed a few years later in an explosion when he was covering the incident in Libya, I believe.
Well, just him knowing that at that point proves the disconnect between what's really going on and what they tell us, Chris.
Well, just an aside, especially about Vietnam. And, my father was COI OSS G2 and CIA. He was branch chief head of all of East Asia Analysis Office. And then he went covert for a while, and he was working for the CIA in Vietnam in 1956. And then he told me, along with a professor from Vanderbilt, Dr. D.F. Fleming, they said that they were playing out a lose scenario in Vietnam. There was never any thought of going in there and taking territory or doing anything like that. It was basically to continue part of their psychological warfare against the American people, and was to they wanted to drug American citizens. Basically, really what Vietnam was about was getting soldiers hooked on heroin and having them sent back home to create this nascent drug culture, so that they could then target the boomers. Okay, but then the boomers blew through that. Okay, and that's what we need to do. We can blow through a lot of their BS. Okay, because that's a lot of what it is. It's BS, and it doesn't really stand on its own. Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
By spreading the truth, and by spreading the truth.
Well,
When I was a kid, before I went to first grade, my mother used to read 5 newspapers a day. And my father would bring home more newspapers when he'd close his store at night. So, I was surrounded by it. So when I got to school, grammar school, and I didn't go to public school. I went to Catholic school for 8 years. My brothers and sister went to Catholic public school. I went to Catholic school, and I was there for 8 years, and I got to the 7th grade, and a nun who had taught my brother stood up in front of the class on the first day of school, and she said, "You have Paul Fitzgerald in your class. I had his brother 15 years ago in my class, and I taught him. I want you to know he thinks he knows everything, but I want you to know I know everything." So this was the kind of attitude that I got. I got it right at home from my mother. My mother said, "Don't let them push you around when you get down there." And the fact is that I learned that. And when I was done with the 8th grade, I said, "Thank you very much for this education and this experience, but I don't think I need any more of that." And I went to public school. I went to public high school and never regretted it. So the fact is that you really have to it's uncomfortable, it's unpleasant. You got to deal with the world as it is, not as how you want it to be. But you have to look at it from a ground level and a realistic basis, and learn, as I said, learn to respect your own opinion and other people's opinion. And sometimes, you get into fights in the high school, in the schoolyard over it, but at least you didn't get told off by Sister Rose Treese.
I want to say something to anyone who might be hearing this, who this is kind of new to you. You can't, the kind of person who thinks you can't fight City Hall. Ask yourself, what are you here for? And ask yourself, what do you think and why? Take a year, young man, young woman. What do you think and why do you think it? And hopefully, after doing that long enough, you'll question the truth of your premises and care about the truth, about who you are, about what it means to be human. You may have to read some history to get some bigger visions of what are the possibilities of a human life. What do we need besides food, shelter, clothing, and companionship and love? Is it respect? Where does that start? How do you earn it? How do you give it? Do you only have what you give? That goes back to what Chris said at the top of this roundtable. There is a right way to walk on this planet, and it is by loving others as yourself. And what John F. Kennedy said, every man can make a difference and every man should try. And what Martin Luther King said and Bobby Kennedy said, little ripples of hope. And also what Lincoln said about, even if I'm the last person faithful to an ideal, at least I'll know I'll have that one friend, and that'll be me. And not that I was the last to quit, but that I never quit.
Any last words from anybody?
About Shirhan's statement about getting an Afghan to go to heaven,
Oh,
please.
the proverb. This is the Afghan
It's an
proverb.
Afghan proverb.
Okay, you can get an Afghan to hell with kindness, but you'll never get them to heaven with force.
Marty, you were going to say something? You need to unmute.
Unmute.
No, I really just want to bridge these Zooms into different universities. And I happen to be in Carmel, California, which is Navy Postgraduate School, the Defense Language Institute, the Panetta Institute. We've got it's a very deep pond here as far as universities go. So I'm putting together packages of the book and JFK's resurrection thing to hand off to these universities.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marty.
Thank you.
And making connections with non-conflict studies
Okay,
in all the universities.
Terrific.
fantastic.
Terrific.
Yeah. We're moving forward.
Yep.
We want our country to be the beacon that it can be. And
Yeah.
I think that's
Our country is the beacon, for sure. It's just the timing is so right. We're in so much synchronicity that it's really hard to be not aware that it actually is coming together. So
Yes, I know. Yeah, that's what we have to focus on. It actually is coming together. Exactly.
actually is coming together. There's no doubt in my mind.
Yeah, I can get depressed about, oh gosh, nothing's changing, blah, blah, blah. And then I'll talk to, like Daniel Hopsick, and he says, things have changed. There have been changes that have happened. There has been, information that has been released, and so and I don't know, I continue to be positive. I continue to see growth in the understanding of people. Okay. And so again, it's about, we have to live together, right? Either that or we all die together, I guess.
We're going into something much further than what we could have ever perceived singularly, but together
Yes.
as a group, it's going to be amazing.
Yeah.
Amen.
Thank you,
Amen.
everybody, for coming today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And
Amen.
I'll talk to you later this week, Liv.
Okay. All
Not
right.
today.
Onward.
Onward.
What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time.